Sampling error is a manageable problem, a well-understood problem. Sampling bias is a lot trickier. Sampling bias occurs because really people being selected into your research, recruited into your research, people you're studying, really aren't being randomly selected at all, even though you're trying to use random sampling techniques. You go through the motions of randomly sampling them, thinking you're randomly sampling them, but you're systematically leaving certain groups of people out of your sample and systematically bringing in other kinds of people and overrepresenting them in your sample. Some people are systematically overrepresented in your sample. Some people are systematically underestimated. Now, remember when we talked about simple random sampling, one of the basic criteria is everyone has an equal chance of being selected. That's one of the defining characteristics of a simple random sample. With bias samples, that isn't true, even though you may not really understand it isn't true. In other words, sampling bias is something that a lot of times you kind of stumble into. It's a mistake you make. It's something bad that happens to you if you're a researcher. It's certainly not something that you try to do. You're trying to do random sampling, but something goes wrong and you wind up getting a biased sample. Why might you get biased samples? Well, we can only touch on that subjects, but let me mention a few reasons why you might get biased subjects or biased samples. One is the way that you as the researcher go out and select and recruit your subjects. For example, in today's world, trying to pick people in the telephone book, that would be a problem because lots of people don't even have landlines, and some of the people that are in the telephone book have more than one telephone in their household, so you might have an extra chance of counting them. But even more importantly, a whole lot of people aren't listed in the phone book for a variety of reasons. Maybe they don't have phones at all, maybe they have cell phones, maybe for that matter they have unlisted numbers and so forth. So, the names listed in the telephone book are a very different group of people than people in the general community, if that's your population. So using the telephone book might very well lead to a biased sample. For example, you might oversample elderly people. You might oversample people who are middle class or business people. On the other hand, you might underrepresent people who are poor, people who are young, people who are more socially isolated and simply don't talk on the telephone and so forth. But the larger point is how you go about selecting, contacting, recruiting your subjects can unintentionally impose bias on your sample. In fact, there's been classic historical cases where we know that's happened, and actually we're going to talk about those in class. At any rate, it's a broader question and problem. I'm just giving you one simple example, but the larger point is how you recruit, select your subjects can ultimately impose a bias. But it's not just your fault or your problem about how you go about sampling. Your subjects can impose sampling bias in ways that are difficult to anticipate and sometimes almost impossible to control. You call people up on the phone or contact them on the internet, however you're contacting them, and maybe they aren't home, or maybe they don't respond, or maybe they refuse to cooperate. Non-response rates, when you contact subjects but they refuse to cooperate, they refuse to participate in your research, can create sampling bias. The higher the rate of non-response, the higher the potential for a biased sample. Because once again, the people who do volunteer for the research and actually go along with it may be very, very different than the people who select themselves out. It's really a variation of that issue that we talked about earlier when we talked about differences between random and non-random samples. But here, you're trying to do a random sample. But when you're doing it, you still need subjects to actually actively cooperate with you. And you know they can often say no. The more of them who do say no, the more likely it is to impose serious sampling bias on you. They get a sample ultimately that's very different than the larger population that you want to generalize to. And what makes this even more problematic is that you may not know exactly what kind of bias it is. who is being overcounted, oversampled, who is being undersampled, and how it might influence your results. That gets really, really, really tricky and complicated. And unfortunately, increasing your sample size is not going to solve the problem. Remember with sampling error, if you were worried about that, you could reduce sampling error by increasing sample size. Sampling bias, it doesn't work that way. If using the telephone book generates a biased sample, then calling more people out of that same phone book isn't going to solve that problem. You're just going to wind up with a bigger sample which is every bit as biased. Biased samples, in some cases you can detect the bias, in some ways you can anticipate it, maybe plan for it and figure out ways to avoid it, sometimes. In other cases, it's very difficult to anticipate, and ultimately it's very difficult to understand exactly what's going on under the surface. So you may think you have a random sample, but you don't really have one at all. Now, one hint you have is the stronger your response rates, the higher your response rates. More generally, the better your internal validity. But that's not an absolute guarantee.